A single beam of spotlight cut through the dim backstage corridor, illuminating a lone janitor's battered mop bucket at rest beside an open piano lid. Sam Carter froze mid-step when a loose floorboard betrayed him with a sharp groan, an echo that rippled through the hushed grandeur of Lexington ballroom. Heart-pounding, he darted toward the Steinway, catching a falling velvet glove before it struck the polished keys. In that charged instant, the lustrous black wood of the piano seemed to pulse beneath his fingers as though alive with memory. He steadied himself, breath rasping in his chest, every nerve alight with the electric possibility that tonight would be unlike any other. If this moment gave you chills, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter in Sam's journey, where every note carries the weight of a lifetime. Sam Carter eased the glove into his pocket eyes, fixed on the Steinway Model D, as if it were an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The gala was still 2 hours away, yet the hall buzzed with unseen currents. Florists whispered about centerpieces. Waitstaff rehearsed silverware placements, and a lone violinist tested a single crystalline A. Sam wiped his palms on the worn cloth at his side, each pass uncovering a sheen of lacquer that shone like glass beneath the overhead chandeliers. Though his uniform was ink-stained and frayed at the cuffs, he moved with the precision of a craftsman who had once known the intimacy of ivory and ebony beneath his fingertips. 8-year-old Emma Carter watched from behind a velvet curtain, her small frame framed by a halo of warm light. She had followed her father into the ballroom against the rules and against her better judgment, but his stern whisper earlier had melted into something gentle when he'd caught her peeking. Now she crouched low, sketchbook open on her knee, capturing the way his broad shoulders hunched ever so slightly as he polished the piano's rim. Her pencil scratched secretively, immortalizing each whispered curve and shadow. A sharp voice cut through the bustle. Carter. The event coordinator, Miss Whitman, materialized with her clipboard held like a shield. Miss Shaw will be arriving soon. The piano must be flawless. Her tone was businesslike, and Sam simply nodded, a motion he'd perfected to avoid confrontation. He returned to his work, the microfiber cloth gliding in an almost reverent arc across the lid, each stroke echoing with unspoken longing. Emma adjusted her grip on the sketch pad, her pencil pausing over a half-finished rendering of her father's calloused hands. She remembered the nights when Sam would gently coax her into slumber with Chopin's Nocturne played on an old upright, before the hospital gowns, before grief, before cleaning halls replaced concert halls. She flicked a glance at the grand piano as if sensing the weight of its history stored in every polished knot. A ripple of laughter skated across the floorboards. Sam stiffened, cloth held mid-air. He turned to see Richard Blythe descending from the VIP balcony. Silver hair gleaming, ego brimming. Blythe surveyed the scene with a predator's grin. "Remarkable, isn't it?" he drawled, voice dripping with disdain. "Our janitor here treating that piano like a long-lost lover." A handful of staff tittered. Sam's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Emma's pencil resumed its rhythm, sketching Blythe's smirk into oblivion. Blythe inhaled theatrically, then leaned over the balcony railing. His next words dripped with malice. "I wonder if he'd play us a tune. Or is that beyond his pay grade?" Laughter rolled like thunder through the staff quarters, and Sam's fingers curled instinctively around the cloth. He inhaled, chest rising in a controlled beat, then still air. Blythe, expecting fresh jibes, found only Sam's steady gaze. "Do you even know what you're touching?" Sam's voice was quiet, but it carried. The mocking staff fell mute, curiosity blooming in the hush. "This," he said, placing a gloved hand on the piano's side, "is a Steinway Model D 9 feet of Sitka spruce, grown for resonance 17 layers of maple, bent for strength 12,000 moving parts. It costs more than your yacht and holds more stories than your column ever will." Blythe's mouth fell open, and for the first time that evening, Sam allowed himself a small exhale. Without waiting for a reply, he pivoted and returned to his polishing, each pass more purposeful than the last. Emma watched in awe as her father embraced the piano's curve as though offering comfort to a wounded companion. Moments later, the double doors swung wide. A hush fell as Victoria Shaw, the gala's host and a titan of the philanthropic world, entered her presence like a current of silk and steel. She paused at the piano eyes tracing the gleaming surface, then flicked a glance toward Sam. Though their distance spanned polished marble, the look she gave him was intimate and questioning. Sam met her eyes for a heartbeat, then dipped his chin in respect before turning away. He ushered Emma to the wings with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, pencil clenched like a talisman. "It's not just wood, is it?" she whispered. Sam smiled. "No, kiddo. It's a part of who I was and maybe who I can be again." The gala manager signaled their cue, and Sam gathered his cloth and bucket. He moved with quiet dignity, no longer invisible but not yet seen. Emma tucked her sketchbook under her arm, her eyes bright with pride. As they stepped into the corridor's shadows, Sam's heart thrummed with a promise tonight would mark the revival of buried music, the reclamation of lost dreams, and the beginning of a legacy far greater than linens and centerpieces. Silence trailed them like an afterimage, heavy with anticipation. Sam Carter, the janitor, with a war-scarred past and a daughter at his side, was about to step into a spotlight he'd never sought but could no longer deny. Sam Carter moved through the ballroom before the gala began with the sort of quiet precision most people reserve for private grief. The chandeliers overhead dripped prisms of light across patterned carpet, but the world beyond the grand doors never paused to notice the man with the mop. To everybody else, he was just Sam, the janitor, a single dad who quietly tidied up, spilled wine, swapped out trash bags, and grease-stained his coveralls as he polished silverware for the evening's crowd. Yet tonight, under that same golden glow, Sam's calloused hands traced the Steinway's ridges as though it were an old friend returning from a long absence. He lifted the lid to give it one last gentle sweep, his fingers skimming the polished wood with a tenderness no one had ever witnessed before. His shoulders broad from years of military service and burdened by memories he seldom spoke of, bent in homage to the instrument's elegant arc. It was as if Sam carried two lives in one body by day, the invisible custodian who scrubbed floors. By night, someone with the power to awaken music hidden under layers of dust and regret. Emma was safe with Mrs. Patterson in her elementary school's aftercare program this afternoon, Sam had told her before leaving. But once he spotted that familiar sketchbook peeking out from behind the curtains, he couldn't resist letting her watch. Her large brown eyes flickered when she saw him kneel beside the piano dustcloth in hand, and she crept forward until the soft fabric of her hoodie brushed against the stage's fringe. He didn't startle, he only smiled, a quick flash of warmth under the stern lines of his face. Emma settled onto the floor cross-legged and began to sketch the scene, her father alone with the Steinway, bathed in anticipation. When the gala caterers wheeled in trays of canapes, tiny tartlets of crab and avocado, Sam navigated around them, offering a curt nod to the servers without breaking his concentration. He paused to inspect a smudge on the piano's rim, then lifted his cloth and buffed the spot until the wood gleamed again. It occurred to him that the piano might be the first thing he'd polished that wasn't broken in years. In the barracks, he'd scrubbed weapons until they shone like silver feathers. On hospital floors, he'd mopped up spills and bleach so corrosive it burned the soles of his boots. But this was different. This was creation, not erasure. The ballroom staff bustled around him, chatting about centerpieces and seating charts, but Sam felt the room fall away. He inhaled the faint scent of floral foam from the orchid arrangements and the subtle warmth of the Steinway's varnish. It brought back a different life, one he had boxed up and stashed away when Emma's mother fell ill. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the nights when the old upright in their modest living room would carry his sonatas through the thin walls. Emma would drift to sleep as he filled each note with hope, the melodies weaving lullabies that stayed with her long after the keys grew cold. A tap on his shoulder pulled him from his reverie. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," whispered Miss Whitman, the event coordinator whose clipped voice always sounded like she was correcting someone's mistake. "All set here." She gestured at the now flawless piano. He dipped his head. "Yes, ma'am." He turned back to the hall, offering her a small, genuine smile. It was rare for anyone to call him by name, let alone remember it. As she walked away, Sam caught a glimpse of a champagne flute bobbing into view. Victoria Shaw, the gala's chief benefactor, weaving gracefully through the crowd of volunteers. He straightened, tightening his grip on the cloth. Moments later, she paused at the piano, pausing long enough for him to catch the curve of her lips as she assessed his handiwork. Their eyes met for an instant, hers wide with curiosity, his gentle, with an unspoken apology for intruding on her domain. Then she moved on, and the illusion of invisibility snapped back into place. Sam tucked the cloth into his belt and stepped away, blending into the staff like light into dusk. As he mopped a distant corridor, he imagined what it would feel like to walk out onto the stage under all those lights, the hush turning into a single pulse of sound begging for release. He shook the thought off. He was the janitor, not the maestro. His place was here behind a curtain, ensuring the show could go on without a hiccup. In the grand foyer outside, guests in tuxedos and evening gowns chatted about stock trades and boardroom battles, oblivious to the man who made the evening possible. Sam paused by a velvet rope and straightened it with the back of his hand, blinking against the swirl of perfume and laughter. A passing senator raised his glass in the air, gesturing at the room. "Extraordinary Jones," he said to his companion. "Every detail is flawless." Sam swallowed hard, his throat closing around the promise that lectures on perfection now felt hollow. He remembered the moment during basic training when his drill sergeant told him that clean floors and disciplined routines could save lives in combat. It was true then, and it applied now, except life stayed saved in the solemn hush of this grand hall, long after shells and sirens faded. The difference tonight was the steady thrum of something that felt like possibility. Across the room, a table of socialites circled a silver urn of coffee, speculating on the evening's headlining speaker. Sam caught snippets: philanthropy plans, new library wings, scholarship funds, all noble causes, he told himself, but none spoke the truth. He felt in his bones that music could speak when words fell short. He rounded a pillar to find Emma perched on a low bench, idly tracing her sketch with charcoal smudges along the edges. He knelt beside her, and she looked up, eyes breaking with a shy smile. "You're great at it," she whispered, holding up the page. In thick strokes, she had drawn him at the piano silhouette, slicing through the stage light like a hymn. Underneath, she'd written, "My hero needs to be seen." He reached out, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. "You're my greatest audience," he said quietly. She bit her lip, glancing at the grand hall beyond. "Would you ever play again?" she asked. Sam's chest tightened. He folded his arms around her small frame. "I don't know, kiddo," he admitted. "I just don't know." She leaned into him, chin against his chest. The din of guests filtered through the doors, but here in that shadowed alcove, the world was still. He ran his hand over her hoodie, remembering her mother's laughter, as they both practiced scales together before the illness, before the loss. He straightened at the sound of approaching footsteps. Victoria Shaw appeared, footsteps hushed against the carpet. Her gaze flicked to Emma, then to Sam. "You two make a lovely picture," she said. Sam gave a small nod. His mind raced. Was she offering praise or simply making conversation? She smiled, a quick upturn of lips that felt genuine, and turned away, disappearing into the lights. Sam watched her go, and hope unfurled behind his ribs. If the benefactor herself stopped to acknowledge them, perhaps invisibility wasn't a mandate after all. Perhaps tonight he could step beyond mop and bucket, even if just for a moment. He stood bracing himself against the wall. The gala's opening strains drifted from the stage, soft orchestral chords tuning up. Sam closed his eyes for a heartbeat, summoned every ounce of courage he had left. His identity as janitor was a fact, but it didn't have to be the whole story. He took Emma's hand, fingers small and confident in his. "Let's get you home," he said, but she wrenched her sketchbook from his grip and held it high. "I'm not done," she declared. Sam exhaled a laugh, slipping free. She tugged him forward back toward the piano, where light and possibility danced together. As they stepped into the gallery of tapered candles and crystal chandeliers, Sam Carter felt the two halves of himself converge. The uniform he wore belonged to the man who cleaned the floors. But beneath the stage lights, the man who cared for this piano stood ready to be seen. And for the first time in a long while, he believed it might be enough. The hush backstage was a universe away from the glittering ballroom beyond the curtains. Emma Carter huddled in the wing sketchpad, balanced on her knees and pencil poised like a conductor's baton. Her hoodie sleeves swallowed her hands, and her scuffed sneakers dangled over the edge of the low platform. All around her, the muffled chatter of umbrellas and gowns floated through the velvet drapery, but Emma's world was confined to the graphite lines spilling across her page. She traced her father's silhouette, the curve of his shoulders hunched over the piano, the tilt of his head as he inhaled the faint scent of fresh varnish, an old varnish, layered like the rings of a tree. She captured the way his calloused fingers hovered above the ebony keys, as if coaxing a secret melody from their silent slumber. Each stroke she laid down was a silent tribute to the man who polished floors by day to make ends meet, yet polished pianos by heart whenever no one was watching. Her breath caught when Sam Carter shifted his weight, lifting a stray microfiber cloth and smoothing it across the lid. Emma tilted her head pencil dancing to capture the momentary glint of stage lights on the polished wood. Down the corridor, voices swelled in anticipation. The gala would begin any second. But here, the world slowed to a heartbeat, and Emma recorded every detail, the slight crease in her father's faded jeans, the gentle arch of his back, echoing memories she couldn't fully name. A soft cough startled her. Sam stepped back into view, brow furrowed as he checked the alignment of a stray bench leg. Emma swallowed and straightened her spine. She didn't want to be scolded again for sneaking in. But curiosity had carried her this far, ever since she found his old sketchbook buried under a pile of laundry, the one with half-finished music notations and coffee stains. She'd realized that Sam carried a life beyond the mop and bucket, and she needed proof. He finished adjusting the bench and glanced toward the curtain. Emma froze, pencil sharp against paper. For a moment she feared he'd send her away, but instead he offered a small, understanding smile. Emma exhaled, relief flooding her chest. She dipped her pencil back into the graphite, sketching his features, the strong line of his jaw softened around his mouth by the faintest hint of a smile. Sam knelt beside her without a word, as though drawn by her silent determination. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered, voice barely louder than a breeze. Emma tapped her pencil against the pad. "You're good," he said. "Better than good." She felt her cheeks warm. "You're my inspiration," she murmured. The corners of his eyes crinkled, and Emma penciled the smile there. Above them, the band began tuning violin-cello, a low hum from the brass. Emma paused, pencil hovering. She looked up to see Sam standing, reaching toward her. "Come on," he said, gently offering his hand. Emma set the sketchbook aside and slipped her hand into his calloused one. He guided her onto the stage, and Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the Steinway black glass shining like liquid night under the chandeliers. Sam placed her on the bench beside him, settling her feet so they dangled just above the polished floor. Emma gasped and gripped the edge of the bench. From this vantage, she could see the audience chairs lined in perfect symmetry, the crystal stems of wine glasses glinting on silver trays. She could smell the tang of fresh orchids mingled with the faint musk of old velvet. She could hear her own heartbeat as loudly as the tuning oboe from across the room. Sam reached across, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emma's face. "Stay here for a moment," he said, voice soft but commanding. She nodded, breath caught in her throat. He stepped away to fetch his polishing cloth, leaving Emma alone on the bench, pencil still clutched in her hand. She traced the edge of the keys, their smooth white surfaces cool beneath her fingertips, but dared not press them. Instead, she turned back to her sketchbook and redrew the scene, her father's silhouette framed by a cathedral of light music waiting between each line. The hush deepened as the ballroom doors opened and guests began to drift in. Emma listened to the soft rustle of gowns, the distant murmur of voices, the clink of glasses. Positioned on stage, she felt both uncomfortably exposed and utterly enthralled. Sam reappeared at her side, cloth folded neatly in his hand. "Almost time," he said. His gaze flicked to her sketchbook. "May I ask?" nodding toward the pad. Emma handed it over. Sam studied the page with quiet pride, his fingers tracing the pencil lines. "This is beautiful," he murmured. She shrugged, cheeks tinged pink. "I wanted to show you. I know how much you love this piano," she said. "I remember the stories you tell me about Mom playing Chopin." Sam's throat tightened and Emma's spine stiffened. She'd never heard him choke up before. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and led her off stage to a low-lit alcove behind a gilded pillar. "You don't need to hide who I used to be," he whispered, voice thick. Emma shook her head. I want you to feel proud," she said. "You're more than a janitor." Sam held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his uniform. "I've forgotten what that felt like," he admitted. "Thank you." In the corridor, a soft footstep echoed. Victoria Shaw emerged, her tailored black dress sweeping the marble. She paused when she saw them, father and daughter, huddled beneath the chandelier's afterglow, the sketchbook open between them. Her expression softened, and for an instant she looked not like the empire builder, but like a mother protecting her own child. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter." "Emma," she said, voice gentle. Sam straightened, hovering between pride and embarrassment. Emma straightened too, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. "I just wanted to tell you," Victoria continued, "that your dedication, it doesn't go unnoticed. Especially this." She gestured at the page. Emma blinked. Sam blinked. Nobody had ever praised her art so earnestly. Emma wrapped her arms around her father in a sudden hug, startling Sam into laughter. Victoria smiled and slipped away into the golden glare of the ballroom. Sam knelt and brushed Emma's hair back. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home before someone else notices a missing kid." Emma shook her head. "I'm not missing," she said firmly. "You're the one who's about to be seen." He cocked an eyebrow. "And how do you figure that Emma tapped her sketchbook?" "Because this is just part of the story," she said, voice sure. "And people need to know all of it." Sam rose and offered her his hand. Together they stepped away from the pillar toward the awaiting gala. Emma's sketchbook clutched like a roadmap to a future where no part of Sam's life would stay hidden in the shadows. The murmur of conversation swelled to a gentle roar as guests drifted into Lexington ballroom champagne flutes, tinkling in the soft electric light. Somewhere nearby, the string quartet tuned their instruments in a delicate counterpoint, but all of that drifted away the moment Richard Blythe cleared his throat above the din. He stepped down from the VIP balcony with a predatory gray silver hair catching the chandelier glow and cast a slow appraising glance at Sam Carter, kneeling beside the Steinway. Emma, clinging to her sketchbook in the wings, watched in frozen fascination as Blythe's lips curved into a smirk. "Look at him," Blythe announced, voice rich with condescension, caressing that piano like a long-lost lover. His words struck the air like a whip crack. A few servers tittered, pressing their palms to their mouths in nervous laughter. Others shifted, uncomfortably aware that their role was to stay unseen. Emma's pencil snapped to attention, graphite scratching abruptly across paper, one of her delicate lines blurring into an impromptu smudge. Sam's hand froze on the polishing cloth. For a heartbeat, the world slipped into a taut silence. The polished wood gleamed beneath his fingertips, oblivious to the gasps and giggles. He straightened slowly, cloth in hand, trying to anchor himself against the tidal wave of ridicule. In the hall beyond, guests paused mid-step, heads turning at the unexpected interruption. A cluster of socialites in sequined gowns exchanged glances, part intrigue, part shame for having been party to the critic's mockery. Emma pressed herself against the curtain, heartbeat thrumming in her ears. She remembered her father's stories of boot camp and battlefield discipline, where a harsh word could cut deeper than any wound. This was different, but the pain felt just as sharp. She traced a trembling finger across the page of her sketchbook, as if she could erase Blythe's cruelty with one stroke. Instead, she watched her father rise, each inch of height reclaimed with quiet dignity. Sam Carter released a steady breath, the kind that comes from years of training under fire. He placed the cloth gently on the bench beside the piano and lifted his chin. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the gravity of every eye in the room bearing down on him. Yet beneath the sting of humiliation, something flickered, the memory of ivory keys under his fingertips, the thrill of coaxing a melody into being. He met Blythe's gaze, and for a moment time untangled itself. Blythe clapped his hands, once punctuating the moment with triumph. "Honestly, I've seen showmen with less theatrics. Who gave this man permission to treat art like sentimental rubbish?" A ripple of laughter followed, but a few breaths later, it dissipated under the weight of Sam's steady silhouette. The critic's insult felt stale now, like a cracked record playing to an empty auditorium. In the hush, Emma crept forward, sketchbook clasped to her chest. She stepped into a sliver of light, cheeks flushed, and dared to speak. "He's not sentimental," she said, voice small but clear. "He's remembering." The words hung in the air, a single bell note cutting through the scoffs. Heads turned toward the wings, surprised by the child's courage. Sam's eyes softened when he saw her, and he bent to scoop her into his arms, her hoodie sleeves brushing against his uniform. Blythe's smirk faltered for the first time. He folded his arms, a challenge in his posture. Yet he said nothing, as if unsure whether to release another barb or concede that the room had shifted around him. The murmur of the quartet rose again, as if to fill the void. Guests leaned in curious to see what would unfold: the graceful rescue of a father by his daughter, or the critic's next cruel crescendo. Sam set Emma down gently and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. His voice when he spoke was calm, soft as dusk, yet carrying to every corner of the hall. This piano, he began without looking at Blythe, was built to hold voices. He paused, letting the words settle. Emma watched his lips, learning the cadence of a man about to reclaim his own story. The audience leaned forward in sympathy, caught between expectation and hope. A waiter appeared at Sam's side tray, raised in a reflexive gesture, but Sam shook his head. He reached instead for the bench fingertips, brushing the satin polish. The Steinway seemed to respond, a low hum vibrating through its frame. Blythe cleared his throat, ready to pounce on any further slip, but the critic's next words died in his throat as the hall absorbed Sam's quiet presence. Emma crept back to Sam's side, pressing her sketchbook into his palm. He looked down, reading her silent vow, "I see you." Sam inhaled, shoulders straightening as the warmth of the room pressed in. In that charged instant, the critic's laughter felt small and hollow. Sam Carter, once invisible now, carried himself with the bearing of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. The hush deepened as each guest realized they were witnessing something more than a gala mishap. They were watching the quiet reclamation of a man's dignity, one that could no longer be silenced by a snide critic's laugh. Sam shifted the bucket in his hand, the water sloshing against the lip, as if urging him forward. He set it down with deliberate care, then turned on his heel to face the gathering crowd. "It's a Steinway Model D," he said softly, voice steady despite the tension knotting his chest. 9 feet of Sitka spruce and hard rock maple, 12,000 moving parts each, crafted for resonance and strength. He paused, letting those words settle in the hush that fell like a velvet curtain. "It costs more than your Mercedes, Mr. Blythe," he added, his eyes flicking toward the critic's stunned stare, "and it holds more stories than your column ever will." For a breathless moment, nobody moved. The caterers froze mid-step. The violinist's bow hovered over a string, drawing a single quivering note. Even Emma, standing at her father's side, clutching her sketchbook, held her breath so tightly her small shoulders trembled. Then the silence deepened, spreading through the room like ink and water, until it felt as though the walls themselves leaned in to hear Sam's quiet declaration. Richard Blythe's face shifted through a cascade of emotions: surprise, indignation, wounded pride. He cleared his throat as though finding his voice after being thunderstruck. Some of the younger staff members exchanged glances, their earlier giggles gone, replaced by a tentative respect. A few guests edged closer, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. Were they witnessing a private reckoning made public? Behind the stage curtains, wrinkled backs, straightened tuxedoed shoulders squared. The impromptu humility lesson was unfolding at the piano, and everyone could feel its gravity. Sam let his words hang for another heartbeat, then bent down and picked up his mop bucket as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the way he carried himself now, head held high, shoulders unburdened by self-doubt, spoke volumes more than any sweeping declaration ever could. Emma brushed a stray curl from her forehead, her pencil poised to capture not the shame of her father's earlier humiliation, but the quiet power of his comeback. From the balcony, Victoria Shaw watched the scene unfold with sharp, discerning eyes. She had arrived expecting pomp and seamless perfection, but here was something raw, a man willing to stand up for what he knew, even when it risked his anonymity and possibly his job. She traced the grain of the piano's rim with a thoughtful finger as she descended the staircase, her heels clicking a steady rhythm that echoed Sam's newfound resolve. A murmur rippled through the guests. Conversations that had stalled on superficial pleasantries now found substance. Someone whispered to their neighbor, "Did you hear that?" Another nodded, lips pressed together in appreciation. In the hush, a distant timer chimed the signal that the opening performance would begin in 5 minutes. The quartet began to tune again, but this time their notes carried a fiercer beauty, infused with the tension Sam had unleashed. Emma leaned closer to Sam and whispered, "That was amazing." His eyes softened when he looked at her, and he knelt to be eye level. She pressed her sketchbook into his hand. The page was smudged with graphite and hope. "You see me, Dad?" she said, voice warm with pride. He smiled, tucking a lock of her hair behind her ear. "Always," he replied. The critic, for his part, recovered a sliver of composure. Blythe raised a single eyebrow and murmured, "Well, I suppose facts do matter." His tone lacked its earlier arrogance, more a grudging concession than genuine humility. When he turned to join the guests, it felt less like a retreat and more like a course correction. He walked past Sam without a word, but the stiffness of his posture spoke of the respect grudgingly earned. Sam dusted off his hands and glanced at the piano for the first time in years, as if seeing it anew. He recalled the last time he'd performed on a grand instrument, an elegant recital hall in Vienna, the applause echoing like distant thunder. He remembered the thrill that had coursed through him when the audience rose to their feet, and the heartbreak that followed when he walked away from the stage, trading concerts for custodial carts. He had hidden that past behind a mop's handle and a job that demanded invisibility. Yet here, under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, he realized that invisibility was no longer his refuge. It was his cage. Footsteps tapped on polished marble. The event coordinator approached, clipboard in hand, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mr. Carter," she stammered. Voice low. "The doors open in 2 minutes." "The guests will be seated." Sam nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. She held his gaze as if searching for some hidden reassurance, then scurried off to prepare the stage. Sam took a deep breath, letting the moment ground him. Victoria stepped up beside him, eyeing the sketchbook in his hand. "May I?" she asked softly. Sam extended it with a nod. She examined Emma's drawing, her father kneeling beside the piano, captured in charcoal silhouette. Victoria's lips curved into a genuine smile. "She has talent," she observed. "And so do you, Mr. Carter." The words felt like a benediction, warm and illuminating. Sam met her gaze, surprised by the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "I appreciate that." He hesitated, the weight of an unspoken question pressing on him. But the moment passed as the quartet's first violin drew a tentative bow across the E string, sending a pure note spiraling through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced from the podium, voice echoing like a trumpet call. "Welcome to tonight's musical gala, sponsored by the Lexington Arts Foundation." Applause erupted, filling the space with renewed energy. The magician's show was about to begin, but in the wings, a different kind of magic still trembled in the air, the magic of a man rediscovering his voice. Sam set his bucket aside and straightened his coveralls, smoothing away imaginary wrinkles with a steady hand. Emma slipped her hand into his, the warmth of her grip steadying his racing heart. He stepped forward to stand behind the audience curtain toes, brushing against the fringe caught between the world he'd known and the world he was ready to embrace. As the curtains parted, revealing the stage bathed in soft white light, Sam watched the quartet's opening chords bloom into the hall like the petals of a night-blooming rose. Each note carried its own resonance, and he felt the piano's heartbeat pulse through the floorboards. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him, washing away years of regret. When he opened them again, he met Emma's gaze from the side of the stage. She nodded a silent promise that she believed in him. He nodded back a vow that this time he would not retreat. The world beyond the piano keys was watching, and he was ready to step into the light he'd once feared. Sam took a final breath and stepped away from the curtain, leaving behind the bucket and the shadows. The audience leaned forward, expecting the evening's scheduled performers, but Sam Carter was not on the program. Yet as the quartet's finale note faded, the audience felt a shift, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Was this truly the end of his story, or merely a prelude to something greater? Victoria Shaw swept through the ballroom like a monarch reclaiming her throne. The hush that settled when she entered wasn't imposed by force. It was earned by reputation and presence. Her sleek black jumpsuit clung to her frame with precision-tailored elegance, the kind of garment that whispered power with every step. She wore no jewels heavier than her steady stare, and her hair was swept back into an elegant knot that spoke of boardroom battles won and empires built. Victoria paused at the fringe of the orchestra's warm-up light, her eyes drifting first to the crystal chandeliers overhead, then to the gleaming Steinway Model D at center stage. The piano's polished surface caught the glow and reflected back like a dark mirror, and she recognized a reverence in its shine she'd never seen in her usual circles of suits and champagne. As she navigated through clusters of socialites and philanthropists, Victoria's gaze skimmed the room, cataloging the evening's players. A senator adjusted his cufflinks near the dessert table. A famous actress murmured into her date's lapel microphone, and a tech billionaire lingered by the silent harp checking his watch. But beneath the orchestrated glamour, Victoria sensed a tension. The memory of something unsaid stirring the air. Between the glances cast toward the stage and the subtle tremor of expectancy, she realized the gala's true performance might not unfold under the spotlight. Something essential was happening backstage, invisible to the program's script of speeches and sonatas. Victoria paused in front of the piano, one hand brushing a phantom fingerprint from the lid. The wood felt alive beneath her fingertips, as if it held the weight of every note that had ever sung through its frame. She tilted her head, noticing a figure slip away into the shadows. A man in a janitor's uniform, mop bucket in hand, shoulders squared with a quiet dignity that set him apart from the staff. She recognized him from her brief earlier glimpse, Sam Carter, the custodian whose dedication to perfection was whispered about among the event planners. She watched him pause in the wings, meeting her eyes for a single heartbeat before ducking out of view. In that glance, she saw more than a cleaner fulfilling his duties. She saw a man carrying history in his posture, a man rarely allowed to be more than part of the scenery. A waiter glided up to take Victoria's glass, and she handed it off with a nod, permitting herself a moment to observe. She wondered what stories lay beneath Sam's stillness. A performer might bask in applause, an executive might crave headlines. But this janitor moved with restraint, as though every step held a secret. The chords of the opening quartet shifted from tuning notes to first measures of Mendelssohn, and Victoria felt the room tilt toward decorum. Yet her attention remained fixed on the shadow where Sam had disappeared. She allowed herself a small, curious smile. Emotions were liabilities in her world, yet curiosity was the kindest sin she permitted herself tonight. Victoria drifted deeper into the crowd, exchanging polite nods and soft greetings, yet her eyes continuously flitted back to the stage wings. Each time a server passed by, she blocked their path and whispered a question. Where did Mr. Carter go? He was just here. The servers exchanged nervous glances. She was the patron of this gala, after all, but offered only vague directions backstage corridor or behind the curtains. Unsatisfied, Victoria excused herself from a senator's tale of international finance and slipped through a narrow side passage marked staff only. The corridor was dim, lined with thick velvet drapes that absorbed the ballroom's applause like mourning shrouds. She reached the staff area, where a single bulb cast a pool of light over buckets of cleaning fluid and stacks of unused linens. Sam stood by the edge of the stage, mop in hand, shoulders relaxed, yet alert. There was no trace of embarrassment on his face, only a calm collectedness Victoria found refreshing. She cleared her throat gently. Mr. Carter? She called, voice steady. He turned surprised but composed. The fluorescent light softened the edges of his uniform, revealing faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, lines that spoke of long nights and responsibility beyond a job description. Ms. Shaw, Sam replied, dipping his chin in a respectful nod. He set his mop aside as though instinctively knowing it would be awkward between them. Victoria stepped forward until the bustle of the ballroom was muted behind the drapes. I wanted to thank you, she said, choosing her words with precision, for the care you've shown this piano. It's the centerpiece of tonight's gala, and I've never seen someone treat it with such reverence. She paused, measuring the effect. Sam's eyes flickered with courtesy and something deeper surprise, perhaps, that a billionaire would notice him. Sam straightened, scanning her face. It's more than just wooden strings, he said, voice low. It carries memories. It carries the music that built this hall and the dreams people hope to bring here. He waited, watching her reaction. Victoria studied him, realizing that in one quiet exchange, the hierarchy that governed her world had shifted. She had spent decades commanding spaces. But here was a man whose quiet devotion held more gravity than any of her endowments. A muffled trumpet fanfare from the main hall signaled the gala's commencement, the first note of formality. Sam glanced toward the curtain, then back at Victoria. If you'll excuse me, he murmured. She caught his arm before he turned away. No, she said, surprising herself. Stay. He hesitated, mop bucket casting a small shadow between them. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. Tell me your story, not as a janitor, but as the man who chooses to care. Her tone lacked the boss's edge. It was softly insistent, a genuine request that drew on the vulnerability she kept locked away from most. Sam met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat that stretched long enough to echo the quiet between them. Then he exhaled, seeming to decide that a janitor's courage was worth more than invisibility. "All right," he said, brushing a hand through his hair. "But not here." He gestured toward the side door marked Green Room. Victoria nodded, curiosity flaring bright. She followed him past linen carts and empty water bottles into a small rehearsal space where the quartet had left their music stands and a single chair glowed under a lone spotlight. Emma peeked around, the cornered sketchbook in hand. Her father caught her eye and offered a reassuring nod. Victoria's gaze softened as she watched the two of them, the janitor and his daughter, sharing a private moment amid the gala's pomp. Her own pulse quickened, not with the thrill of business conquests, but with something gentler, the invitation to witness a human story unfurl. She stepped fully into the room, shutting the door on the glittering ballroom behind her. The spotlight pooled on the Steinway's keys, and Sam gestured to the carved legs of the piano, as though introducing a loved one. Emma settled beside him, proud and patient, ready to learn. Victoria crossed her arms, leaning against the wall like a student settling in for an impassioned lecture. The gala's queen had arrived, but tonight the true sovereign of the evening was not the woman who built empires. It was the humble janitor who held the power to transform silence into music, to remind even the wealthiest audience that the heart's quiet truth outshines the brightest chandelier. Sam guided Emma through a narrow corridor lined with crimson drapes, each step muffled against the plush carpet. The distant hum of conversation and clinking glasses faded behind them, replaced by the muted thrum of his own heartbeat. They paused beneath a single spotlight that slanted through a crack in the curtain, painting Emma's face in soft gold. Sam knelt, folding his coat so it wouldn't brush against her hoodie, and reached into his pocket. He held out a tiny charm, a silver music note barely larger than his thumbnail. Emma's breath caught as she recognized it, the same charm she'd once found tangled in a tangle of keys in his old leather notebook. He pressed it into her small palm. "Music isn't always heard," he whispered. Voice hushed against the backdrop of hushed anticipation. Emma's fingers curled around the cool metal, and tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. "It remembers what's been lost." Sam added his thumb, brushing her knuckles. She nodded slowly, blinking away the sparkle of emotion. The charm felt heavy in her hand, as if it carried centuries of unsung melodies. Behind them, a stagehand opened the doors, and the first guests began to drift in their laughter, filtering through the curtain like the first notes of an overture. Sam stood, slipping an arm around Emma's shoulders and drawing her close. "Promise me you'll keep this safe," he said softly. "And remember, every time you feel lost or scared or lonely, you can hold on to this because music holds on to you too." Emma leaned into him, pressing her cheek against his coat. "I will," she whispered. "But what if I forget?" Sam smiled, gazing down at her with the gentle patience of a teacher. "Then I'll remind you," he said. He stepped back, sweeping a hand toward the stage. "Come on, let's find our seats before anyone notices we're missing." They emerged into the ballroom just as the opening chord of the quartet reverberated through the hall. Emma's fingers closed around Sam's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. He led her past rows of polished chairs, slipping into the shadows beside the stage. She perched on a cushioned stool he'd pulled from a nearby stack, tucking her legs beneath her. Sam crouched beside her, resting one arm on his knee. "I want you to remember something," he said, eyes fixed on the bowed heads of the violinists tuning their strings. "Music isn't just sound. It's memory, emotion, and every whisper of the heart. It's the way your mother used to hum when she thought nobody was listening. It's the last lullaby she sang you, the song I never got to finish for her." Emma watched his jaw tighten, but he swallowed the lump in his throat before continuing. "Every time you play, you bring a piece of who you are into the world," he told her. "You're sharing your story, and you're letting other people feel theirs. That's why tonight, no matter what happens, you need to trust that if you ever choose to play, it will matter." Emma's brow furrowed. "But I'm only 8. What if I mess up?" Her voice was small, laced with the same insecurity Sam had once carried into the wings on countless evenings when she'd begged him to let her try a single note. He reached over and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. "Messing up is part of the music," he said. "It's how we learn where the melody lives. Remember when we practiced that simple scale last week and your fingers kept missing the C sharp? You got frustrated and wanted to quit. Emma nodded, recalling the tears she'd shed when the note wouldn't ring true. But then you slowed down, listened to the note you wanted, and found it. Sam continued, "That moment when you finally landed on the right key, that was you remembering your strength. That's exactly how music remembers you." Emma considered this, staring at her hands. The charm lay heavy in her palm, as though pulsing with promise. She tucked it into her pocket and met her father's gaze. "Do you think... could I ever play for real?" she asked quietly. Sam's eyes softened into something like wonder. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Of course you could. And when you're ready, I'll be right there beside you." He tapped the side of her hoodie. "With your sketchbook and that charm and whatever courage you can bring." The lead violinist lifted her instrument and the first strains of Schubert's Ave Maria blossomed through the hall. Emma's lips parted as the rich melody spilled out, weaving around the guests in the candlelit room. Sam slid a slender Yamaha fold-down keyboard onto the edge of the stage, one he'd smuggled from home for just such a moment. He placed it in front of them and turned back to Emma with an encouraging smile. "Want to try?" he offered, brushing aside the protective dread in her eyes. Emma glanced at the keyboard, its keys gleaming like tiny pearls. She shook her head. "Not yet," she whispered, lowering her gaze to her lap. Sam nodded understanding, blossoming in his expression. "That's okay," he said softly. "You'll know when you're ready." He took a breath, leaning back to watch the performance through the slit in the curtain. Emma perched beside him in silence, her breathing steadying as the music wove its spell. A sudden murmur rippled through the audience. The first guest had risen, offering a polite standing ovation for the quartet's opening piece. Applause cascaded, and in that sound, Emma heard a distant echo of her own heartbeat. She turned to see Sam, smiling at her pride shining in his eyes. "See," he murmured, "music makes people feel something. That's why it's worth the risk." He reached into his coat again, pulling out a small folded scrap of sheet music, one he'd written in the margins of his old notebook. He unfolded it and laid it on Emma's lap. "This is for you," he said. The notation was simple, a few bars of a lullaby he'd once composed for her when she was too sick to sleep. The melody was unfinished, trailing off into open spaces. Emma's fingers traced the notes, her brow crinkling with concentration. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours." Sam told her voice thick with emotion. "Whenever you want to remember what we had or what we lost or what we can still create, play this for me." He brushed away the tremor in his own voice and offered her the sheet. Emma tucked it into her sketchbook and nodded. The gala's master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, his voice bright. "Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the stage for a special surprise presentation." A soft gasp of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Sam inhaled, glancing at Emma. Her eyes were wide with wonder, and something else, a spark of readiness he hadn't dared to hope for. He reached down and squeezed her hand. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered, leaning close enough for her to feel his breath. Emma took a trembling breath of her own, closing her eyes for a moment, as if summoning a secret strength. When she opened them, Sam saw the choice reflected in her gaze. She nodded once, firm and sure. Sam rose, gathering the mop bucket and cast-off coat, and stood at the edge of the stage. Emma slipped from her stool and took her father's hand. The gilt frame of the Steinway glinted between them, its polished depths reflecting an entire lifetime of music waiting to be shared. With a final squeeze of her hand, Sam guided Emma onto the stage. The curtain rustled behind them, and the audience hushed again, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Emma's small hand trembled in his, but Sam held it steady, his whisper of encouragement lost to the growing echo of footlights. "Music remembers what's been lost," he said under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Emma inhaled, stepping forward until her other hand hovered over the keys. The world beyond the piano fell away once more, and for a moment Sam saw only the two of them, father and daughter, bound by melody and memory. The hush deepened as Emma's fingers touched down on the first note of the lullaby, soft, unpracticed, but utterly true. And in that single moment, every whispered lesson and every untold story converged, carried on a note that would not soon be forgotten. The soft glow of the chandeliers had settled into a comfortable warmth when the hall's rhythm shifted. The second act was underway. Artists in gowns and tails wove through delicate melodies. Yet somewhere beyond the notes, attention began to coil. Emma sat beside Sam, her small hand tucked into his sketchbook resting against her knee. He offered her a reassuring squeeze. She returned it with a determined nod. Their lullaby had landed like a tender confession, and for a moment the audience sat wide-eyed in stunned reverence. Then, like a dropped pebble splashing into still water, Richard Blythe rose from his seat at a central table glass raised high in a mocking salute. In his tailored tuxedo and silver-vaulted hair, he appears more conductor than critic. Janitor, he called, voice crisp and public. Why not give us a tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, perhaps? His laugh rippled through the audience like shards of ice, and the chatter that followed crackled with cruel delight. The quartet's second violinist faltered, bow hovering over the string as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Emma's breath caught. Her father's jaw tightened just beneath the podium's glow. She pressed her sketchbook to her chest, pencil poised in silent sympathy. Sam's cheeks warmed, but his posture remained upright, unbowed. He could feel every eye in the room picking him out. The hostess, the VIPs, even the senators gesturing toward their programs. Blythe's taunt was aimed at invisibility, daring him to emerge from the shadows and prove his worth. For a moment, no one moved. Then came a ripple of awkward chuckles, courtesy laughter to fill the vacancy Blythe had created. A few servers exchanged tremulous shrugs. Wine glasses rattled in uncertain toasts, and the murmur of the string bass quieted in anticipation of an upheaval. Emma watched Sam's hand inch toward the mop bucket at his side, his knuckles whitening around the handle. She leaned forward so slightly that her hoodie slipped against the bench's edge. Sam glanced down at her eyes, gentle but fierce. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if to say, "Stay with me." Emma's fingers squeezed his in response. He took a breath as though inhaling a storm, then turned his gaze to the center of the floor, where Blythe still stood triumphant. The critic's glass caught the candlelight glittering like a lure. "You speak so eloquently about this instrument," Blythe taunted, stepping closer until his voice resonated like the crack of a whip. "Surely you know a scale or two. Come on, show us something. Even a child's melody would be charming." He arched an eyebrow and the room stifled laughter like a reluctant audience. Sam's lips pressed into a firm line. Behind him, Emma's pencil drooped pencil tip, grazing the blank page as she waited. A heartbeat later, a single decisive clap rang from the front row. Emma followed the sound with her eyes and saw Victoria Shaw rise from her seat, placing her pristine wine glass atop the stage's edge with deliberate calm. The rim of the glass caught the light and sent a slender beam into the critic's face. The room fell instantly silent, the hush swelling until it felt as though every breath in the hall hovered on the brink of discovery. Victoria held Blythe's gaze with the same unblinking confidence that had built her corporate empire. "Enough," she said, voice low but unmistakable. The single word carried the authority of someone who understood power not as noise but as presence. Blythe shifted, caught between irritation and respect, and for the first time he lowered his glass. Sam drew in a slow breath. He set his mop bucket aside, and every spectator leaned in, sensing that tonight's true performance had begun. Emma clutched his hand, her courage kindled by Victoria's intervention. She raised her head and met her father's eyes. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. A soft rustle passed through the crowd as Victoria stepped away from her seat and moved toward the stage. She glided across the polished floor in silent authority, her black jumpsuit flowing behind her heels, clicking with a measured rhythm. When she reached Sam's side, she reached down and placed her hand over his. The unexpected warmth of her touch ignited the hush into something alive. A breath held a world paused. "Mr. Carter?" she said, voice intimate enough for him alone yet resonant throughout the hall. "Would you honor us with the music you spoke of earlier, the music that remembers?" Her words danced in the space between them, a beckoning promise that transcended Blythe's mockery. Sam felt the weight of that invitation settle on his shoulders like a mantle. He glanced at Emma, who sat perfectly still, pencil forgotten on her sketchbook. Her eyes shone with fierce expectation. Around them, the audience leaned forward as though the next breath of music might reveal something sacred. Even the quartet had ceased tuning. Their bows rested on violin bridges, instruments waiting in solidarity. Sam nodded once, a gesture both humble and resolute. Victoria withdrew her hand, stepping back into the shadows, and the hush deepened until it felt like standing beneath a cathedral's dome, every footstep muted by sacred awe. Sam moved forward with the unhurried grace of someone returning to a long-lost home, each step echoing on the hardwood like a heartbeat. Emma rose and joined him, placing her small hand atop his work-worn one. Their silhouettes merged in the stage's soft glow, father and daughter, custodian and heir, two hearts tethered by melody. Sam lifted the piano's fallboard and settled onto the bench, the cool veneer beneath his fingers, a welcome anchor. He glanced at the audience, blinking against the spotlight, and found Victoria watching from the wings, her expression unreadable yet encouraging. Emma perched on the edge of the stage beside the bench sketchbook clutched in her lap. Sam drew in a steadying breath and laid his fingers on the keys. The hall waited, every breath lodged in silence. Then from somewhere deep within, he summoned a single note, a trembling E that rang soft and pure. The note resonated through the rafters, stirring the air like a quiet prayer. Sam closed his eyes, letting the next notes flow from memory, the chord progressions he'd practiced on borrowed uprights, the arpeggios he'd coaxed from rented instruments, the lullabies he'd composed for Emma in tender nights of need. The melody unfolded slowly, each phrase heavy with longing, each pause pregnant with unshed tears. Emma drew her pencil across the sketchpad, capturing the shape of each note in graphite, an unseen hymn made visible. In that moment, Blythe's sneer had vanished, replaced by the rigid stillness of disbelief. The critic's glass lay forgotten on a nearby folding table, half empty and cold. The guests leaned forward, breath held, as if the walls themselves strained to listen. Victoria stood behind them all, her posture relaxed but her eyes unblinking, absorbing every nuance of Sam's playing. The music swelled into a choral arc, a gentle crescendo that cradled loss and hope in tandem. Sam's fingers danced with newfound certainty, weaving tenderness into the melody's heart. Emma watched his profile from the stage's edge, her pencil pausing only to record the quiver of his chin, the set of his shoulders, the ache and release that shaped each bar. When the final note hung, suspended an echo of silence itself, the room exhaled in unison. The hush shattered like glass, replaced by a roar of applause so genuine and fierce it felt like redemption. Sam opened his eyes to see the audience on its feet, tears glistening on cheeks both young and old. He rose from the bench, eyes brimming, and allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement. Emma darted onto the stage, flinging her arms around his legs in a triumphant embrace. He scooped her up, her laughter ringing over the clamor of clapping hands. Victoria descended the steps and joined them, her smile radiant and free of the usual corporate polish. She wrapped an arm around Sam's shoulders and leaned in, speaking words unheard by all but him. Sam looked out at the stunned crowd, philanthropists, critics, socialites, all witnesses to the quiet truth he'd unveiled. In their faces, he saw astonishment, respect, even humility. The gala's script had been rewritten on the spot, not by speeches or formal performances, but by a dare that dared to be answered and by a woman brave enough to step in when mockery threatened to steal the moment. As the applause rippled through the hall, Sam held Emma close, the charm she wore glinting at her neck. He understood now that tonight's true performance had never been about perfection or pedigree. It was about remembering loss, remembering hope, and remembering the courage it takes to reclaim a voice buried beneath silence. And in that remembered music, an invisible man found himself seen at last. Sam Carter's pulse thrummed in his ears as he stood just beyond the fringe of the stage's velvet curtain. The applause from the quartet's encore still rippled through the hall, but all of that faded when he met Emma's wide, expectant eyes. Her small hand gripped his with the quiet insistence of a tether. She needed him here now. He set his polishing cloth on the sideboard with deliberate care, as though laying down armor before battle, and lifted his chin until the stage lights caught the faint gleam in his eyes. His first step onto the polished wood sounded like a drumbeat in the hush that fell. Each echo carried the weight of every moment he'd hidden, every backstage sweep, every aisle mopped, every shadow he'd slipped through. Now the silence leaned in around him, curious and hungry. He could feel it pressing against his uniform, warm as the breath of 1,000 strangers waiting to discover who he really was. Emma slipped beside him, her dress sneakers brushing the stage floor. She glanced up at him, eyebrows lifted in both pride and gentle concern. Sam nodded once, a small gesture that passed between them like an unspoken vow. Then he inhaled, tasting the air scented with orchids and polished wood, and planted both feet firmly as though staking a claim. The lights blazed brighter, threading through the chandelier prisms and scattering rainbow flecks across the rows of seated guests. Sam swallowed, having almost forgotten how bright a spotlight could be. The audience leaned forward, tuxedos and gowns shimmering in soft anticipation, their programmed excitement shifting to raw curiosity. Somewhere to his right, Richard Blythe's silver hair glinted as the critic raised an eyebrow, half in disbelief, half in challenge. Sam took another step, the stage beneath him alive with reverberations. He felt each footfall like an exclamation point. This was no longer about cleaning a piano. It was about reclaiming a voice buried under years of survival. He allowed himself a moment to appreciate the grandeur, the vaulted ceiling that arched overhead like a cathedral, the carved wood panels that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless performances, the hush that had settled like sacred dust. Emma followed, drawing her own breath deep enough to make her small chest swell. She carried her sketchbook in one hand, pencil clipped to the cover. Sam had taught her that art could capture truth in silence, and tonight her presence here affirmed his own truth. He glanced at her and saw tears glinting on her lashes. Not tears of fear, but of pride. He reached a polished Steinway bench, its glossy sheen reflecting the stage lights in muted arcs. Without breaking his stride, Sam eased onto the bench, the wood settling under his weight with a faint creak. He removed his hand from Emma's and turned, motioning for her to perch on the stool beside him. She sat, knees tucked neatly beneath her, clutching her sketchbook, as though it held all their shared memories. Sam steadied his breathing, his heart pounding in sync with the faint pulse of the grand hall. He rested his hands on his thighs, feeling the worn leather of his gloves brush against his coveralls. He glanced up at the audience, finding Victoria Shaw in the front row. She watched him with an intensity that felt like understanding. Her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, as if she too had been waiting for this moment. Across the aisle, Blythe sat rigid, his critic's mask slipping for an instant as Sam's presence erased the lines of derision from his face. The senator at table 3 set down his wineglass, leaning forward as though drawn by a magnetic force. A famous actress caught her date's arm to hush him, her eyes wide with genuine intrigue. The gala's meticulously planned program had been disrupted, and a new story was unfolding in real time. Sam exhaled, closing his eyes for a heartbeat. He could feel the grain of the piano's ivory and ebony just inches from his fingertips. He remembered the first time he'd pressed a key in his childhood home, the way the vibration had shuddered through the floorboards and into his bones. He remembered the applause in recital halls and the hush that followed when he'd step away. He remembered the grief that had silenced him, a silence he'd carried like a wound. Emma placed her small hand lightly on his shoulder, a gesture so delicate it felt like a prayer. Sam opened his eyes and caught her gaze. She nodded once, as if giving him permission to speak the words he'd been holding inside. He swallowed, and then with a steadying breath he reached forward and lifted the fallboard. The piano waited like an old friend awakened from slumber. The keys gleamed, each one a promise of sound, of memory, of stories waiting to be told. Sam's gloved fingertips hovered above the first octave, trembling only slightly. The hush deepened, stretching until every guest seemed to hold their breath, waiting to hear the music that would speak for him. Sam pressed down on a single key, middle C. The note rang pure clear, resonating through the air like a beacon. A single ripple of sound knocked against the velvet hush and carried into the wings, where the stagehands paused in mid-task. He allowed the note to bloom, rising into the rafters and drifting back down like a whispered secret. He leaned into the piano, eyes half closed, and pressed the next note. Then the next. The melody unfolded tentatively, at first a simple motif, almost mournful in its honesty, as though each phrase were a confession. His fingers moved with deliberate care, coaxing out the hidden tremors of the piano's soul. The audience sat spellbound, no longer spectators to a gala, but witnesses to a private unveiling. Throughout the hall, breaths caught and hearts stirred. Emma sat wide-eyed beside him, pencil poised, but still as though she dared not break the sacred hush. Sam's chest rose and fell, the rhythm of his playing echoing the rhythm of his return to self. Each chord rang with the resonance of years spent silent, each pause a testament to the strength required to step into the light. In the front row, Victoria Shaw's expression softened from curiosity to reverence. She pressed a hand to her chest as though the music had touched a place she hadn't known was aching. Blythe, once the embodiment of disdain, now sat trembling with surprise. The senator wiped a tear from his eye. Even the most practiced socialites bowed their heads, letting the melody wash over them. Sam closed his eyes fully and allowed the music to guide him. The motif grew richer, weaving in subtle arpeggios that spoke of hope, kindled in darkness of resilience born from loss. His gloved hands danced over the keys, each movement precise, yet imbued with heartfelt vulnerability. The piano's voice rose and softened, carrying the hushed confession of a broken heart that dared to sing again. Around him, the grand hall breathed in unison. The wood-paneled walls seemed to lean closer. The chandelier's crystals shimmered in time with the melody, and the stage lights glowed like embers of a newly lit fire. Sam felt the weight of the moment settle around him, not as a burden, but as an embrace. He was home. Emma reached up and laid her palm flat on the bench beside him, offering silent solidarity. Sam smiled a small, tender curve of lips and nodded gratefully. The final notes blossomed, rising to a gentle peak before tapering into a soft, lingering hush. He lifted his hands and let them float above the keys, suspended in the quiet that followed. The world held its breath for the length of a heartbeat, and then the hall exhaled. Applause erupted like waves crashing against a shore fierce and full of awe. Sam opened his eyes to a sea of standing guests, their faces alight with wonder and respect. The encore had arrived, unbidden, an outpouring of gratitude for the truth he'd offered. Sam rose from the bench, shoulders steady, and turned to Emma. She beamed up at him, tears glinting in her eyes, the charm she wore nestled against her heart. He scooped her into his arms, her laughter chiming above the thunder of applause. Together they faced the audience, the janitor and his daughter, no longer hidden, walking into the light they had earned at last. Sam's fingers hovered a moment above the keys, gathering something deeper than practice or perfection, an echo of bedtime lullabies, a tremor of unshed tears. Then he pressed the first note, soft, deliberate, a single C that hung in the air like a whispered secret. It trembled for an instant as though uncertain it belonged before blooming into the next note, an E, gentle and yearning. The audience leaned forward as though drawn into a confession that bypassed words altogether. Emma watched in awe as her father eased into the melody he'd kept locked away for so long. There were no showy flourishes, no rapid-fire scales or dramatic arpeggios to impress. Instead, each bar felt like turning a page in a private journal. The ballad unfolded with a delicate elegance, each phrase infused with grief for the loss he'd carried and hope for the promise of new beginnings. In every rise and fall of his right hand, you could hear the memory of Emma's first cry, the ache of her mother's absence, and the steadfast determination to keep moving forward. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, their prisms catching the candlelight and scattering it across the polished floor. The rich oak walls, carved with scenes of past triumphs, now bore witness to something more intimate, a man rediscovering his own heart in a single haunting melody. Guests seated in front paused mid-clink, champagne glasses forgotten, as the music washed over them in waves. Somewhere near the back, a senator dabbed at the corner of his eye, his wine glass trembling in his hand. At table 5, a socialite pressed her fingertips to her lips, eyes glistening. Richard Blythe sat unmoving in the VIP row, arms folded, jaw clenched. The critic who had waged war with words all evening now looked disarmed, his smirk replaced by a brittle stillness. Sam's ballad rendered all analysis futile. There was no clever turn of phrase in art criticism fine enough to dissect a soul laid bare by melody. Blythe's notebook lay closed on his lap, the pen forgotten as he struggled to capture a feeling that defied description. Victoria Shaw rose from her seat and crossed her arms, her sharp gaze melting into something like reverence. She remembered the first time she'd heard a piano in her mother's grand drawing room, how the notes had filled her like sunlight through stained glass. Now she felt the same warmth and recognition sweep through her, as if Sam's ballad had reached across social aisles and corporate boardrooms to speak directly to her own hidden longings. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the music stir the places she'd long ago learned to keep silent. On stage, Sam's left hand wove a gentle counterpoint, warm, steady chords that cradled the fragile melody above. Emma shifted on her bench, pencil in hand, but she didn't draw. Instead, she pressed a finger to her lips in concentration, letting the music paint pictures only she could see moonlit nights, when her father had hummed to her by the nightlight, hospital corridors where he'd tiptoed to the piano in the dead of night, the empty apartment where every note had once felt like both a refuge and a reminder of what was gone. As the ballad climbed, Sam's shoulders rose in a silent crescendo of emotion. The melody threaded through minor keys and major resolutions, tracing the arc from sorrow through acceptance to a fragile joy. His gloved fingertips brushed the edges of the keys as though coaxing hidden tears to the surface, then guiding them gently toward release. Somewhere in the middle, he paused for a length of silence that stretched like a held breath, an articulation of absence so powerful it resonated louder than any chord. The audience exhaled aloud, catching in throat and chest. Then Sam returned to the melody's final reprise this time, with a warmth that felt like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. The chords rang clear, each one carrying a weight he'd embraced rather than avoided. He closed his eyes and allowed the last notes to drift, holding the final chord until it shimmered and receded like a tide. For a heartbeat, nothing stirred except the echo of piano strings settling back into repose. When the hush finally broke, it did so in a rush of applause that felt less like approval and more like gratitude. Guests sprang to their feet, rising in a spontaneous standing ovation. Sam opened his eyes to a sea of faces alight with wonder. Friends and strangers moved beyond privilege or position, touched by the simple truth of a father's lullaby. Emma climbed off the bench and raced into his arms, wrapping her small arms around his waist. He lifted her up and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder, still swaying as though guided by the piano's fading resonance. Victoria strode forward through the clapping crowd, her heels forging a clear path across the marble floor. She reached the stage and held out her hand to Sam, helping him stand steady. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing that." Sam nodded, blinking back tears that gleamed in the stage lights. Emma slipped from his arms and stood between them, sketchbook clutched under her chin like a prized treasure. In the aftermath of the unexpected melody, the gala's program lay forgotten. The quartet exchanged uncertain bows in a corner, their opening pieces rendered secondary by this intimate revelation. Servers hovered with trays of untouched hors d'oeuvres, unsure whether to applaud or simply step aside. Even Richard Blythe, once the loudest voice in the room, remained seated, his expression unreadable but softened by genuine respect. Sam stepped forward to the edge of the stage, his uniform smudged with a thin sheen of sweat, and offered the bench a silent nod of farewell. Emma slipped her hand into his again, and together they walked down the few steps to the front of the stage. The applause roared anew, not as polite ceremony, but as an outpouring of emotion too deep for words. Under the chandelier's glow, Sam and Emma stood side by side, a picture of resilience and love made visible. The crowd leaned in, eager for a glimpse of the man who had dared to transform his sorrow into song. And in that moment, the Steinway sat quiet behind them, its polished surface etched with a story that no critic could ever reduce to a few cold sentences. It had borne witness to a truth that transcended status, a lullaby woven from grief and hope, and the unexpected melody that reminded everyone listening that sometimes the most powerful performance is simply to be brave enough to play from the heart. Victoria Shaw's standing ovation was the first spark that ignited the room's collective reckoning. Her applause rolled through the hall like thunder, unplanned and utterly genuine. For a moment, Richard Blythe's meticulously sculpted smirk wavered, then collapsed altogether. His veneer of superiority cracked in the face of something undeniable. The guests, arrayed in silks and tails, sat breathless, as though caught in the wake of a revelation rather than a performance. Sam Carter stood at the foot of the stage, shoulders squared, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with something altogether new: vindication. Emma slipped her hand into his thumb, brushing the leather cuff of his coat. She held her breath, waiting to see what would come next. The hall's hush lingered as if no one quite knew how to follow such an unguarded benediction. Then applause broke out again, feverish and sincere, rising like a tide of gratitude and wonder. Servers paused in mid-step wineglasses, trembling, their reflections shimmering in the crystal chandeliers. A socialite dabbed at her eyes with a lace napkin, her voice caught in an unspoken "thank you." From his vantage behind the podium, the master of ceremonies swallowed hard, his carefully rehearsed introduction abandoned. He cleared his throat, but the words that came were lost in the swell of appreciation that washed through the crowd. Victoria stepped forward, crossing the polished floor with quiet authority. When she reached Sam and Emma, her eyes glistened. Without a word, she swept an arm toward the audience, inviting them to share in the moment's intimacy rather than its pomp. Sam swallowed awareness of every gaze sharpening his senses. The critic who had once belittled him now sat rigid glass still in hand, powerless to reinterpret what he had just witnessed. For years, Blythe had dissected performances with cold precision, reducing artistry to bullet points in his column. Tonight, his analytic scalpel had been rendered irrelevant by a melody born in the heart's shadows. He lowered his glass, meeting Sam's steady gaze with something unspoken, an acknowledgement that true talent could not be contained by pedigrees or privilege. Victoria crouched beside Emma, tucking a stray braid behind the girl's ear. "You were magnificent," she whispered, voice hushed but unwavering. Emma blushed, glancing up at her father. Sam's chest tightened with pride as he watched his daughter glow under the rarest form of praise, the kind bestowed by someone who understood the courage it took to stand unmasked. A hush fell again as Victoria rose to address the room. Her voice carried across the hushed audience, firm yet warm. "Tonight we witnessed more than musical skill," she said. "We witnessed truth, courage in its purest form. We were reminded that art belongs not to prestige, but to the souls brave enough to share it." She swept a hand toward Sam and Emma as though the pair were living embodiments of her declaration. "Let us honor that bravery and let it guide us beyond this hall." The guests rose once more, this time in a salute that felt more like collective exhale than formal tribute. Sam stepped forward, releasing Emma's hand to gather his composure. He dipped his head to Victoria, offering a silent thank you for shattering the illusions that had kept him unseen. Then he turned to the audience, glancing over the sea of faces that had arrived expecting polished performances, but had instead found raw humanity. He raised a palm in acknowledgement, his simple gesture met by another wave of applause. The sound rolled through the hall like a benediction, each clap a testament to empathy triumphing over spectacle. In that moment, Sam felt something shift deep within the weight of invisibility, lifting, replaced by a quiet conviction that his place was not behind the mop bucket, but wherever music called him to stand. Emma bounded up beside him, sketchbook clutched to her chest, her earlier trepidation replaced by a radiance that mirrored the chandelier glow. She whispered something in his ear, and he laughed, a sound rich with release. She pointed toward Blythe, who sat frozen in contrition, and Sam's laughter softened into something gentle as he gently squeezed her hand. At table 7, a group of benefactors huddled in impromptu clusters, trading tears and affirmations. A widow confessed she hadn't felt moved since her husband's memorial concert. A veteran admitted the melody had unlocked memories he thought forever buried. Sam listened, heart swelling, as strangers spoke of private healing sparked by his unguarded song. It occurred to him that the piano's keys were not just levers and hammers, but portals to the hidden chambers of the soul. The in-house photographer, a career professional who normally snapped forced smiles and posed candids, lowered her camera and let it dangle by her side. She walked forward, clicking off the safety catch, and raised her lens. But instead of capturing the expected tableau of MCs and dignitaries, she composed a shot of Sam and Emma in a shared embrace beneath the chandelier's warm glow. The resulting image would later grace the Foundation's newsletter, but tonight it felt intangible, a secret slice of truth unspoiled by corporate branding. Behind the scenes, stagehands peeked from the curtains, letting themselves wonder what it would feel like to turn a mop handle into a conductor's baton, to find a latent dream breathed into life by a spark of courage. The orchestra members, Kit tucked beside them, exchanged astonished glances that spoke more than they could articulate. Music meant more than practice, fame meant more than applause, and a single melody could unravel the world's expectations in one unassuming moment. Blythe finally rose stiffly and approached Sam. The critic's hand extended slow and deliberate. Sam paused, fingers twitching, before he accepted the gesture. Blythe's grip was firm, his eyes searching for a trace of performance behind the warmth in Sam's gaze. Finding none, he nodded once as though conceding that no words could capture the truth, now luminous in the pianist's stance. "Thank you," Blythe said softly, an admission more potent than any scathing review he'd ever penned. Sam inclined his head, offering a curt smile that blended respect with quiet defiance. The critic turned away, slipping back into the ranks of guests, now redefined by a single honest performance. Victoria cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention once more. As we resume our evening, she announced, voice resonating through the hall's vaulted arches, let us carry this moment forward. Let the melody you heard tonight echo in every act of kindness, every note of collaboration, and every silence filled with empathy. She raised her glass in a final salute, eyes glimmering with unshed tears and renewed purpose. Sam stepped back Emma at his side and watched the gala's tide wash away pretense. He realized that while the evening's applause would fade, its impact would endure in whispered reminiscences and private piano benches and in the courage of those who witnessed a janitor teach the world how to listen. His own illusions, the ones that had bound him to anonymity, lay shattered at his feet, fragments glinting like diamonds in the chandelier light. Emma looked up at him, eyes alight with unspoken plans and uncharted possibilities. He knelt beside her, lifting her chin so they could look into each other's eyes. "We did it," he whispered. Her grin was all the confirmation he needed. The gala's finale swelled once more, but Sam and Emma had already heard their true encore, the awakening of every listener's heart to the power of honest music and the grace of a voice reclaimed. The door to the old chapel creaked on its hinges, a sound that felt like the first breath of a place awakening from a long sleep. Sunlight slanted through tall, stained glass windows, painting the dust motes in ribbons of ruby and sapphire. Sam Carter paused in the threshold, Emma's hand warm in his as he took in the rows of wooden pews, now repurposed into seating for small ensembles. The pulpit had been cleared away, and in its place sat a polished baby grand piano, its lid propped open like a welcoming smile. Victoria Shaw stood nearby, arms folded, watching their reactions with a mixture of pride and anticipation. "I wanted a space where music could really live," she said, voice echoing softly against the vaulted ceiling. Not the grand concert halls, this place felt more honest. It's closer to where people's stories begin. Sam nodded, stepping forward and trailing his hand along the piano's rim. He remembered the first time he'd pressed keys in a cramped practice room, the tremor of possibility coursing through him. Now that same pulse thrummed beneath his fingertips as he lifted the fallboard and let the keys glint in the morning light. Emma slipped onto the bench beside him, sliding her sketchbook into her backpack. Victoria led them past a stack of folding music stands and scattered instrument cases. "I've spoken with the foundation board. They're fully behind a series of free community workshops, veterans, school kids, anyone who's ever needed a place to feel seen." She smiled at Emma. "And you'll get first pick of drawing spots." Emma grinned and ducked her head, cheeks pink. Sam tuned the piano, each A440 hammer striking a chord of promise. A nearby table held cans of paint and brushes for mural work, and behind it lay stacks of sheet music ranging from Bach preludes to pop ballads. Volunteers bustled in and out, carrying chairs and sweeping the floor, their chatter a friendly buzz. It reminded Sam of his own first gigs, only now there was no rush to hide backstage, no fear of being found out. Here he and Emma belonged. "Would you like to play something?" Sam asked, glancing at Victoria. She nodded, crossing to the front row of pews. "Play anything," she encouraged. "Let this room remember what it once knew." Emma watched her father's gloved hands hover above the keys. She remembered the gala's hush, how the hall had leaned in to hear his story. Now the chapel waited with equal anticipation. Sam took a breath and pressed the first chord, a rich C major that resonated in the rafters as though unfolding the stones themselves. He followed with a gentle arpeggio, the melody unfolding like a sunrise in sound. Emma closed her eyes and let the notes drift through her, her pencil poised in case inspiration struck. Victoria sat forward, elbows on her knees, rapt. Behind her, volunteers paused to listen. So this was what transformation sounded like, every note a bridge between past and future, every pause a space for healing. When Sam reached the final chord, the chapel remained quiet for a heartbeat, then warmed with applause so full of gratitude it felt like reunion. "That was beautiful," Victoria said, stepping forward to meet them. "Thank you for bringing the soul back into these walls." She swung open a side door, revealing a small office turned into a music library, shelves lined with donated books, vinyl records, and instruments in various states of repair. "I want this to be your domain," she told Sam. "Pick what you need. Teach the classes you want. I'll handle the rest." Sam surveyed the trove guitars, violins, even a drum set tucked in a corner. He thought of the veterans he'd met who missed the camaraderie of barracks bands, the kids who yearned for after-school outlets, the seniors whose stories lay silent in attic trunks. "This is more than I ever dreamed of," he said quietly. Emma slipped her hand into his and he ruffled her hair. "Let's give it all back." Over the next weeks, the chapel hummed with activity. On Monday afternoons, Sam led a listening circle for veterans, each man and woman taking turns at the piano to coax memories back into the light. He taught them simple exercises, scales that whispered home chords that spoke of courage. Outside, Emma set up her easel, sketching each player with a tender eye, capturing lines of wisdom on creased faces. Families drifted in after work, toddlers toddling between pews, their laughter threading around the music. On Tuesdays, the stained glass light bathed after-school students in color as they crowdsourced songs. One wanted to learn jazz riffs, another begged for pop chord progressions. Sam demonstrated slowing down each measure until hesitant fingers found confidence. Emma flitted among them, clipboard in hand, drawing staffage, and taking notes. Which child lit up at the tempo change, which student needed a guiding finger. The chapel walls echoed with youthful energy. No slick stage, no gilded facade, just people learning to listen and to be heard. Midweek, the chapel's doors opened to underfunded schools. Sam taught music theory with a whiteboard scraped from the old church office. Volunteers served hot chocolate and pastries in the foyer, their chatter as lively as the piano's echo. Emma organized quick sketching sessions where each child illustrated their favorite song. Soon, the chapel's side walls filled with vibrant murals, a cascade of musical notes, portraits of composers, and whimsical dreamscapes wrought in charcoal and watercolor. The dusty chapel had become a gallery of second chances. On Thursday evenings, Victoria herself led a patrons practice, inviting local donors to mingle with students and veterans. She stood at the back, wine glass in hand, chatting with community leaders who once only cared about gala guest lists. Now they asked about Emma's drawings, about which veterans had mastered their first chords, about how many kids had shown up that week. Sam saw her sparkle in ways he'd never seen under the harsh lights of boardroom dinners. This was warmth born of purpose, not profit. Friday mornings brought gentle solos. Sam and Emma rehearsed their duet, the piece he'd half written for her on that first night. They smoothed out the final measures, her small hand dancing a counterpoint, while his glided through the melody's arch. Their music filled the chapel as morning light crowned the pews, creating halos around dust motes and dreams alike. After they finished, Emma looked up breathless. "Do you think people will ever stop listening?" she asked. Sam smiled, sweeping a lock of hair from her eyes. "I think they always will, as long as we keep reminding them why." On weekend afternoons, tourists and curious passers-by ambled in expecting dusty pews and a stale echo. Instead, they found a living community hub. The baby grand sharing space with a cello doubled as a welcome sign, a small bulletin board advertising upcoming chapel concerts and family music nights. Emma greeted them at the door, sketchbook in hand, offering free postcards bearing her own drawing of the chapel's stained glass rose window. Visitors lingered over cups of tea, listening to senators and street artists share a bench, their barriers dissolved by the simple truth of shared melody. One evening, as twilight deepened, Victoria returned to find Sam alone at the piano, hands poised but unmoving. Emma sat beside him, perched on a cushion, head resting on her father's shoulder. Victoria slipped in quietly, her heels silent on the carpet. She watched them for a long moment, letting the hush surround her before stepping forward. "You've done something extraordinary here," she whispered. Sam rose, closing the fallboard with a soft click. Emma hopped to her feet, hugging his waist. Victoria knelt to meet Emma's eyes. "Your drawings have already inspired more than I could imagine," she told her. Emma's grin was shy but proud. "Thank you for letting me help." Victoria rose and looked from Sam to Emma and back again. "This is just the beginning," she said, voice full of promise. "I want to fund a scholarship in Sam's name, one that sends underprivileged students to music camps and covers instrument rentals for families who can't afford them." Sam's eyes widened. Emma gasped. He reached out, taking Victoria's hand with gratitude. "I don't know what to say." Victoria winked. "Just let me handle the paperwork. You two just keep making music." They spent the rest of the evening walking through the empty chapel. Emma pointed to her murals explaining each element, the broken piano keys mended by rainbow chords, the marching notes symbolizing veterans' marches home, the lulling crescent moon cradling a violin's silhouette. Sam listened, his heart full, realizing the chapel had become theirs, a haven where stories once forgotten were retold in melody and sketch, where every visitor could find a place to belong. Before leaving, they paused beneath the largest stained glass window, a kaleidoscope of saints and symbols now refracted into something new by the chapel's second life. Emma lifted her face to catch a shaft of green light on her cheek, and Sam draped an arm around her shoulders. Victoria watched them, the chiaroscuro of hope and healing playing across their faces. "Here's to second chances," she said softly. Sam nodded, pressing his palm to the cool pane. And to remembering, he added, voice rich with promise. Emma slipped her hand into his, the tiny charm he'd given her still resting against her heart. Together, the three of them stood in the stained glass glow, a found family, bound by music art, and the shared courage to start again.